Adventurous kids explore with education and learning what a wildlife is in the Everglades. I want to explore the Museum of Discovering Science. What plants do butterflies like? I want to know about Key West. Adventurous kids, learning and fun. Adventurous kids!
Today I'm going to tell you about the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was an ongoing fight for racial equality that took place over 100 years after the Civil War. After the Civil War, many Southern states continued to treat African Americans as second-class citizens. Before the 1960s, North America was a very different place. In many parts of the country, African Americans were barred from lots of public spaces. Movie theaters, restaurants, buses, schools, and trains all had separate areas for black and white customers. African Americans also had to live in separate neighborhoods and couldn't hold the same jobs as whites. This practice of separating African Americans from white people was called segregation. Segregation was widespread, touching every part of society. They implemented laws that kept black people separate from white people. These laws became known as Jim Crow laws. In the early 1900s, black people began to protest the Jim Crow laws that Southern states were implementing to enforce segregation. Several African American leaders, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, joined together to found the NAACP in 1909. Another leader, Booker T. Washington, helped to form schools to educate African Americans in order to improve their status in society. In 1951, an African American student named Linda Brown was barred from attending the school closer to her home. Instead, she had to ride a bus to a black school across town. Her father joined a dozen other parents and sued the school board. By 1954, the case had gone all the way to the Supreme Court. The Civil Rights Movement gained momentum in the 1950s when the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in schools was illegal in the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In 1955, an activist named Rosa Parks was arrested for not giving up her seat on the bus to a white passenger. That was the rule back then in Alabama and throughout most of the South, that African Americans had to give up their seats if any white people were standing. Jo Ann Robinson, another activist, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister, organized a boycott of the city's bus system. This sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted over a year. They chose to walk rather than submit to unfair regulations. The boycott led to a lawsuit, and in 1956, a Supreme Court decision banned segregated buses. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other brave activists organized nonviolent protests across the nation. During sit-ins, black students visited whites-only lunch counters. They quietly sat there until they were served or until the store closed. As a result, they were often harassed or even arrested, and freedom riders rode buses from other states throughout the South. They were there to make sure the buses were integrated, with blacks and whites sitting next to each other like the law said. These peaceful protests were often met with anger and sometimes violence. The movement reached a high point with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. On August 28, 1963, hundreds of thousands of people marched through the heart of the country's capital. The people sang, "We shall overcome," and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his momentous "I Have a Dream" speech. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. This act outlawed segregation and the Jim Crow laws of the South. It also outlawed discrimination based on race, national background, ethnicity, religion, and gender. Public facilities could no longer be segregated, and businesses would have to make an effort to hire a more diverse workforce. The Civil Rights Act was originally proposed by President John F. Kennedy. Although there were still many issues, this law gave the NAACP and other organizations a strong base on which to fight discrimination in the courts. The 1968 Civil Rights Act, also known as the Fair Housing Act, outlawed discrimination in the selling or renting of housing. On August 6, 1965, another law was passed called the Voting Rights Act. This act was signed into law also by President Lyndon Johnson. This law said that citizens could not be denied the right to vote based on their race. It outlawed literacy tests, a requirement that people be able to read, and poll taxes, a fee that people had to pay to vote. It ended voting restrictions and led to a great increase in the number of black voters. Thank you for watching this episode of Adventurous Kids.
What did you learn today? Adventurous Kids. Adventurous Kids. What was the most interesting fact? Adventurous Kids. Adventurous Kids. Adventurous